This is Paul Fish at my home in Tucson, Arizona on March 16th, 2019. I first became interested in archaeology in junior high school when I found a point on a family farm along an old shoreline of a lake in southern Michigan. And that stimulated an interest that sent me to plowed fields through my high school days. In the meantime, I read everything I could, which wasn't all that much, in Morenci, Michigan. I remember reading Ann Morris's Digging the Southwest and a number of things. I was quite excited about archaeology. But I put that interest on hold when I went to college, where I majored in political science and philosophy, until my junior year when I took a class from Art Jelinek, and it was a survey of world archaeology, and I struck up a friendship with Art, and he invited me to be an NSF undergraduate trainee working in the Museum of Anthropology on Pecos artifacts, where I got to meet a lot of graduate students and other faculty at Michigan, and that reignited my interest in archaeology as perhaps something more than an avocation. Art convinced me to spend my last year taking classes in anthropology, where I took various core courses. In archaeology, I took Jimmy Griffin's famous course on Eastern Woodlands archaeology, and did very well in it, given my affinity towards material culture. And got to meet a number of other professors, Elman Service, and a variety of people that influenced the field of anthropology a great deal. Unfortunately, my first 2 years I had a rather mediocre record, and I didn't get into graduate school at Michigan. So I applied to various places and received funding to go to Arizona State University, which had a developing anthropology program at the time. But I always had an eye to go back to Michigan. And finally, in 1968, I worked at the Turner Snodgrass and was readmitted to Michigan to graduate school. But I had bitten the Southwest bug and decided to stay at Arizona State. In 1969, Art Jelinek, by that time, had come to the Southwest. Although he wasn't at Arizona State, he was at the University of Arizona, and he invited me to go to Taboon with him. And in the successive year, he asked me to come back to Taboon. Taboon is one of the Mount Carmel caves in Israel. And my work there convinced me that I wanted to do a dissertation on the Middle Paleolithic, lithic artifacts, and Art arranged for me to work with Francois Borde for a semester, a little more than a semester, where I collected data on European Paleolithic artifacts and compared them with those in Levant. At the time I was at Arizona State University, most of the other graduate students were interested in Southwest archaeology, and I naturally became involved in projects and discussions about Southwestern archaeology. Ultimately, I was asked to do some contract archaeology with the Arizona State Museum at Lake Pleasant with the Highway Salvage Program under Larry Hammock. Larry, and I needed money at that time, recommended me for a job at the Museum of Northern Arizona, where I worked for 2 years in the Kayenta area, excavating wonderful sites at the base of Black Mesa and the Salt River Project Coal Haul Railroad. At the end of that work, after 2 years, I went back and spent a year working on my dissertation, but not completing it. But they asked me to come back to the Museum of Northern Arizona, where I was involved with a large project for Southern California Edison on the Kaparowitz Plateau. From there, I applied for a job, a faculty-level job at the University of Georgia to manage their emerging cultural resource management program, and ultimately took over a position for Don Grable, who left to come back to the University of Arizona, where I was actually teaching Old World prehistory. Now, the University of Georgia did me a world of good. They hired me, but they said, you have to finish your dissertation within 6 months, or your salary will go down significantly. And so I did finish my dissertation during that initial period at the University of Georgia. I became involved in Hohokam archaeology through Arizona State, and was invited to participate towards the end of my work at the University of Georgia in a symposium that David Doyle and Fred Plog organized on the Hohokam. And Susie, Peter Pillis, and I wrote a paper for the resulting volume in that symposium that gained some notice. At the same time, I was invited to come back to the Arizona State Museum, and for a position that was both to oversee the permitting and state lands archaeology at the Arizona State Museum, as well as to do research and teaching in the School of Anthropology. And Susie and I talked about it. Susie, who had been working in formative period Mesoamerica, about what we could do, perhaps together, to further Hohokam archaeology as a result of that symposium. It was clear that Hohokam archaeology was on the verge of making great strides from that symposium. People were asking all kinds of interesting questions about demography, cultural complexity, social organization, trade and exchange. And it was also clear at that time that there was going to be a real emergence of contract archaeology with the development of the Central Arizona Project and a variety of other kind of mega projects. So it wasn't clear exactly where we could make a big contribution. And we decided to do it in terms of a full coverage survey in Tucson. We decided to structure the survey around an area that was relatively undeveloped in the northern part of the Tucson Basin. And we just decided arbitrarily to use the area that was bounded by urban development, but was going to be affected by urban development. And we pieced together grants from all kinds of different sources, grants and other funding, from the State Historic Preservation Office, a little bit of money from Wintergren, a little bit of money from the NSF, and ultimately a lot of money from the Bureau of Reclamation, who is planning an aqueduct. But that comes later. And we started surveying. We didn't know exactly what to expect. The conventional wisdom was that nearly all of the archaeological sites, at least the residential sites, would be located down near the Santa Cruz River, because the idea of there being a riverine and a non-riverine Hohokam or desert Hohokam was still pretty prevalent. And we started finding lots of sites. And we were finding areas with gaps in sites as well, but sites out in the desert. And ultimately, we were able to define a large multi-settlement community that focused on a platform mound near Marana, Arizona. By that time, we had surveyed about 150 square miles, contiguous square miles. So we were getting a pretty good idea as to what the community and its structure looked like, where it was zonally configured, stretching from the Tucson Mountains to the Tortolita Mountains on the east. And we were getting also a good idea as to what the agriculture looked like in this very late prehispanic period. And that led us to apply to the National Science Foundation for a grant to look in detail at agriculture in that area. We invited consultants, Mexican and Native American consultants, to come out and advise us on how they would farm in these areas. We did some excavation. One of the areas of agriculture that we ultimately focused on consisted of small rock pile mulches that we were able eventually to show were large-scale areas for the cultivation of agave. And that was something totally new. People were getting the idea that maybe agave was cultivated from all of these large contract projects that were going on, and particularly Charlie Mixachek, but also Gasser and a few other archaeobotanists were finding lots and lots of agave in their flotation samples. But conditions weren't just right for people to say, ha, this is cultivated, or this is almost certainly cultivated, or cultivated on the scale that our rock pile fields showed us that it was. We were able to show agave was the principal crop because these fields were outfitted with large roasting pits for the processing of agave. We could tell that that's what it was because no other economically useful plant was found in the pits. And then tools that had been ethnographically associated with agave harvesting and processing were also found in the fields. Once we learned about the structure of this platform mound community, the Bureau of Reclamation approached us, Gene Rogie, who was very anxious to push cultural resource management archaeology to major research findings, approached us and asked if we could shift our survey areas further to the north in areas that the Central Arizona Project canals were affecting and attempt to put their sites into context. The sites that were being investigated in the Picacho Mountain area were sites related to platform mound communities in this area. So what we did was that we started again a full coverage survey, but this time we surveyed using a sampling design that involved basin-wide transects that went every half mile across the basin. And from those, we could outline the configuration of the communities that were involved. And ultimately, we filled in the area. It took us longer than it did the the contract archaeologists working on the various Central Arizona projects. So in one sense, it failed to provide that contextual information to them, but in the end, I think it's provided an important resource for area archaeologists. An interest developed in the School of Anthropology at the University of Arizona to make better use of University Indian Ruin as a result of a major donation that was given to rehabilitate the historic structures there. And because the previous platform mound settlements that we had worked with dated to the early Classic period, and the dominant occupation at University Indian Ruin was a late Classic period settlement, we decided that this would be an opportunity to provide insight into that time period. And for 5 years we conducted field schools at that site. Another interest of ours was the possibility that University Indian Ruin might provide a connection with the historic period. One tantalizing bit of evidence that this might be the case was that one of the Wetherells, when he worked at University Indian Ruin under Byron Cummings, had found a Mahalaka bowl on the floor of one of the rooms of University Indian Ruin. Emo Howery never believed it, but Julian Hayden was firmly committed to the idea that it might be there. We had no idea. While our work at University Indian Ruin has documented very late occupations there, none come into the historic period. We have found Zuni glazed wares in a room and elsewhere at the site that indicate late 1400 occupations, but we're still looking for that link to the historic period. Well, as a result of being at the University of Arizona, we've been able to work with a wide range of really great students, which has provided a lot of insights. We've been able to publish with them, mentor them, see them through their Ph.D.s and on to professional careers. We've also been able to work and be colleagues with people from Mexico and Brazil, which have led us into related but different areas of research. Elisa Villapando and I and Susie have been involved in projects that have attempted to transcend the border between Mexico and the United States since we came to Tucson. Elisa and I organized a bi-national meeting at the Arizona Archaeological Council, which involved 14 archaeologists from working in northwest Mexico who came to Tucson to discuss opportunities and areas of their interests in Southwest archaeology. Elisa and I have been, and Susie have been involved in a number of projects that have involved University of Arizona students and Mexican students who are working in our ENA Center in Hermosillo. In one instance, in conjunction with the project that Randy McGuire and Elisa conducted, we're conducting at Cerro de Trincheras. We did a full coverage survey on a much smaller scale than in the Tucson Basin around the site of Cerro de Trincheras, documenting both earlier and contemporary trinchera sites, and a very dense population of people living in small hamlets surrounding Cerro de Trincheras. We took that and made it a basis of an exhibit that was at both the Museum of Sonora and at the Arizona State Museum, and it traveled around Mexico and in the Southwest as well, ultimately leading to an edited volume by Susie, Elisa, and me that the University of Arizona published. Now, Brazil is, at first, it seems like quite a difference in the archaeology. We became interested in Brazil through a series of workshops that Susie and I and a woman named Edna Morley organized that involved University of Arizona faculty and faculty from the National School of Anthropology in Mexico that took place in Brazil over a period of 4 years. It was the National School of Anthropology in Mexico, connections that filled in gaps that we couldn't get U of A faculty to do in terms of covering, we'll say, North American approaches to archaeology. Edna was a Fulbright scholar at the University of Arizona, and her goal was to learn about U.S. approaches to cultural resource management. We just became close friends, and she asked us, wouldn't it be nice if we could do this? And we were ultimately able to sustain it over 4 different sessions. And these workshop sessions took place in a variety of locations in Brazil, where we met what became our collaborators there, Paulo de Blasas and Maria Dulce Gaspar. And we found that we had some mutual interests in a kind of archaeological site, a constructed mound called a sambaqui, that occurs along the southern coasts of Brazil. They're shell mounds that slowly accrete over time as small burial mounds are constructed. And ultimately they come to contain, or at least many of them come to contain, many thousands of burials. Some of it's due to adaptation and serendipity rather than design. Through my graduate career, my activities were very diverse. I spent a lot of time doing cultural resource management simply because I needed the money. But that in turn generated interests that I wouldn't have predicted in the past. In the same way with my later career, although the Hohokam has been a thread throughout, the University of Arizona has afforded the opportunity to meet people and work with people from outside that institution that in turn has created other opportunities and interests. And I think this diversity of experiences helps you understand different approaches that are taken by different people in different circumstances, and people who come from different training backgrounds, and why they approach archaeology in a different way than you were trained. One of the things that I wanted to mention was how important the people along the way have been to me. Certainly Arthur Jelinek and Jeff Clark at ASU, who were co-chairs of my dissertation, influenced the way I think a great deal and provided opportunities for me to get into Paleolithic archaeology. But there have been a host of other people that have both influenced me and gave me opportunities I happened to work for Larry Hammock and enjoyed his company at the Arizona State Museum. And he recommended me to Lex Lindsay at the Museum of Northern Arizona, where I had the opportunity to work with Peter Pillis, who's been a lifelong colleague, and a host of other people that have been that are in Southwest archaeology. I would say 70% of my peers or people in my age grade passed through the Museum of Northern Arizona at the time I was there. Then off I went to the University of Georgia, where I had met Don Grable as a result of my work at Taboon, and Bruce Smith, who knew me at the Turner Snodgrass site. And I certainly wouldn't even have known of the opportunity there if it hadn't been for those two, and I suspect they had a hand in me getting the job. And then back in Arizona, I had met Jeff Dean. He let me know that a job was open at the Arizona State Museum and that I might have a shot at it. So here I came back again. And then all of the people here at the University of Arizona and elsewhere that have had a hand in helping my career and shaping what I think and do. When I first came to the Arizona State Museum, my duties were threefold. One, I was to oversee the responsibilities of the Arizona State Museum under the Arizona Antiquities Act. Secondly, I was to teach a course in cultural resource management in what was then the Department of Anthropology. And thirdly, I was to conduct significant archaeological research. Under the Antiquities Act, I was responsible for an emerging computerized site file that really slowly developed in Arizona and is still developing, overseeing the issuance of permits to work on Arizona state lands. When I first started, we issued less than 20 permits per year. By the time I stopped doing it, we were issuing as many as 300 permits per year, keeping track of all of that paper and what have you with very limited resources was a major effort. Another major undertaking was overseeing archaeology that was done on state lands and making recommendations to the Arizona State Land Department on what they needed to have done in the way of archaeology. Ultimately, the Arizona State Historic Preservation Office took over that, but that started a survey that we continued for quite a number of years to build up an inventory of surveyed archaeological state trust lands. Gwen Vivian, before I got to the museum, had put in what was called a legislative budget request to provide help in doing this. We were able to hire an associate archaeologist who happened to be Keith Kintig, which influenced the development of our site files greatly, and a couple of archaeologists that it was John Madsen and Rich Lang that actually conducted surveys day in and day out on state trust lands. So quite a portfolio of effort, especially early on. And if I hadn't had that academic setback, I would never have come to the Southwest, never have become a Hohokam archaeology, nor would I have met Susie. has definitely been a major influence on my career. When we came to Tucson, we had 2 young children. We were both interested in doing field archaeology, and we had to settle on a program of research that would allow us both to raise a family, attend soccer meets, and do field archaeology with the Hohokam. We don't always agree on everything, but we do see the world enough alike that it works out okay. It was never our idea that one of us would stay home with the kids while the other went off and did some work. Fortunately, our experiences, Susie's with formative Mesoamerica and mine with cultural resource management, allowed us to find this common denominator of interests. Well, I think we have made substantive contributions to Hohokam archaeology in understanding the formation and structure of these multi-settlement Hohokam communities. I think the agave's an important contribution, but I think probably our most important contribution is in the students that we've mentored. The University of Arizona has provided an opportunity to have some really great Ph.D. students who are now significant professionals on their own in both academia and cultural resource management. And there are a lot of other students that we've simply worked with and published with who we weren't the formal advisors for or were secondary members of their committees. In the course of the Tucson Basin Survey, we employed over 200 students altogether, 200 different students. Some of them, like Jim Bayman and Chris Downham, stayed with the project almost from beginning to end. Others were there for only a semester. Some of the short-term people, like Jim Skibo, published a fair bit on their work with us. I think the major challenges for Southwest archaeology, the major challenge for Southwest archaeology is how to bridge that gap created by the border. In our region, the demographic center is the international Four Corners of Sonora, Chihuahua, Arizona, and New Mexico, not the northern Four Corners. And the northern Four Corners continue to dominate the literature and the interest and the funding for our regional archaeology. And I don't think we're ever going to be able to understand the greater dynamics of the region unless we figure out a way to support archaeology south of the border in the same way. I think for archaeology, North American archaeology in general, is the question of how to generate interest among people outside the profession that is out there, but how do we form a common community with those people? On the one hand, treating archaeological remains that with the same respect that Native Americans demand of us, but at the same time tap into that broader interest that the general public has in the archaeology of the region.